Dramatized account inspired by events and testimonies from December 1944. Some characters and scenes are composite. The personal story you will hear is a reconstruction grounded in the logistical and documentary record of the Ardennes offensive. He was buried alive in the Ardennes. How he crawled out again is hard to believe and harder to separate from the machinery of war that made it possible for some and impossible for many. Imagine a man pressed under a mound of earth, snow crusting his eyelashes, the world above him a churn of artillery and firelight, while the engines that might have saved him cough and die because there is no fuel to feed them. The winter air is thin. His breath comes shallow and wet inside the hollow of a collapsed foxhole. Soil packs against his face. In the dark, he counts the seconds by the rhythm of distant explosions. Boom. Long pause. Boom. Each concussion shakes the earth above his head. He smells something heavy and cloying, diesel and burning rubber, and the smell tells a second story he cannot yet see. The front has become a graveyard for machines. Tanks sit like hulked beasts, their guns glazed with frost. Half a dozen jeeps have gone dead, wheels sunk into the slush. Somewhere beyond the blackened hedge, a depot burns, sending a plume of oily smoke into the sky. This is not only a survival story. It is a story about how the smallest black gauges and the thinnest pipelines can decide the fate of men in the mud. The man under the earth, a private whose name for this narrative is a composite of several accounts, finds himself pinned not simply by collapsing dirt, but by the failure of a system far from his foxhole. Fuel that never reached the front, convoys that could not move, depots destroyed to deny the enemy the very lifeblood of mechanized war. He wakes to the first sensation, the taste of iron and cold. Fingers fumble blindly, searching for purchase. His palms meet splintered wood and torn canvas. He pushes, the ground above shifts minutely, and a cascade of gritty snow falls into his mouth. Panic whispers at the edges, a biological panic that is useless unless shaped into action. He breathes through clenched teeth, remembering a trick learned at some training field months earlier. Make a small pocket of air, move slowly, conserve heat. He forces himself to slow the panic. Outside, the world is violent and indifferent. He tries to call out. His voice is a muffled thing, swallowed by soil. He throws the weight of his body against the softest edge, a root or the rim of a dugout, and for a moment there is movement, enough to let a sliver of cold light find his fingers. He tastes metal and smoke. He remembers jokes told in warmer weather about being leaned on by a mountain of responsibility. None of those jokes help now.
He remembers, too, the sound of engines days earlier, the steady cadence of Allied convoys, the low whine of a pipeline pump, the distant thumps of trucks on a supply route that had become, for the Americans, the artery of the front. In his mind, those sounds are a promise. The German advance had hoped to turn promise into possession, to capture fuel, to keep the engines running long enough to break the front. Instead, when he listens now, the sounds are fragmentary and strained. One engine coughs and dies, another gives a single desperate rev and falls silent. Something in the sleep-sharp space between sounds tells him why. There is not enough of what the manufacturer of war demanded most. The guns and men are not lacking in courage, they are lacking in gallons. Before the story returns inward, we need to step back and see why a man could end up pinned under earth and silence because of fuel. The Ardennes, December 1944, was not merely a battlefield of tactics and terrain. It was the place where modern war's arithmetic became visible, a ledger of production, transportation, and consumption writ across forests and frozen hedgerows. The German plan for a surprise offensive depended on moving a large armored force rapidly through the Ardennes to the Meuse and then on toward Antwerp. Mechanized units require fuel, not some, but prodigious quantities. The planners assumed a short, sharp operation. Their calculations did not fully account for the reality of modern logistics as a sustained industrial enterprise. On one side of the ledger was an industrial colossus, Allied output from American refineries and American pipelines, tankers and truck convoys. Goods did not arrive by prayer, they arrived by assembly lines, siphoning crude into refined fuel and into tank trucks, by soldier drivers and civilian port laborers, by the mammoth choreography of the Red Ball Express, an unglamorous, relentless operation of trucks and men that moved fuel and supplies from beaches and depots to the front. Pluto, the pipelines under the sea that linked supply points to the continent, and the overland pipeline systems and railhead transfers together created what looked to soldiers like abundance. Against that abundance, the German side faced an acute scarcity. Allied bombing had eaten into German fuel production, and the Reich's remaining supplies were dispersed across depots, jerry cans, and the often precarious holding points of an army on the move. Part of the German plan counted on seizing Allied fuel caches as a force multiplier. When the Wehrmacht's spearheads advanced, they expected to refuel from captured stocks, from jerry cans abandoned in retreat, from the pockets left by a sudden breakthrough. That expectation shaped decisions at each level: the pace of advance, the allocation of scarce diesel, the routes chosen by armored formations.
The pivot moment for this story, the discovery that shifted both morale and strategy, came when Allied forces stumbled upon enormous storehouses of fuel at a place referenced in several accounts, Hansfeld. To German eyes and to many soldiers on the ground, the sight was obscene and demoralizing. For a force already feeling the shortage, discovering intact enemy fuel dumps was an act that cut to the bone. To the Allies, it was evidence of the mismatch in industrial capacity. While German frontline units struggled, American logistics had created reservoirs of fuel so large they could be left, for a time, largely untouched. If Hansfeld was a revelation, Stavanger was a counterpoint, a deliberate act of destruction that underscored the strategic logic of denial. As the front lines braided through Belgium, there were moments when capturing supplies was less possible than destroying them to keep them from falling into enemy hands. Allied engineers and commanders, faced with the possibility of German capture, sometimes set fires to their own stores. The sight of flame turning mountains of fuel into black smoke was grotesque and necessary. It was the practical expression of a grim arithmetic: better to burn than to empower. For the soldier under the dirt, the burning depot and the abandoned tanks above him were threads of the same fabric. He could not read the military charts that showed pipelines and convoys, but his ears and nose could confirm the strategic truths. Engines were dying for lack of fuel. Convoys were scarce. Abrahamic promises of attrition had been replaced by a new reality where pipelines and factories determined movement. The Red Ball Express is a name that now carries a certain mythic quality. To the drivers and loaders who worked it, it was a relentless day-by-day trade. Buy time with miles. Columns of trucks moved almost non-stop, prioritized to feed the front, rerouting when roads crumbled under bombardment and frost, crossing bridges of ice and wood, racing against weather and enemy action. The system could not create fuel out of thin air, but it could move what the factories produced to points where fighting happened. Where the Red Ball moved, tanks kept their engines turning. Where it faltered, engines stopped and men became stranded.
Beneath the poetic force of those systems lie numbers and capacities that changed the map of possibility. American tank production, refinery output, and the logistical infrastructure created a kind of ocean in which Allied armies could swim. The German side found itself navigating a drying river. Those differences are not romanticized, but mechanical. A tank without fuel is a weight of metal. An army without fuel is an army that cannot exploit success, cannot retreat smoothly, cannot evacuate the wounded, cannot resupply ammunition to where it is needed. And when a front depends on speed, those deficiencies become catastrophic. Back in the foxhole, numbness has set in to the soldier's limbs.
He presses his shoulder against a splintered board and finds a jagged hole in the boot of his right foot. The pain is sharp when he wiggles his toes, but the colder thing is the knowledge that time compresses and decision-making must be clear. He takes stock. He has a folded map in the breast pocket, a half-empty canister of tobacco, an empty ration wrapper, no lighter. He hears the nearby crack of wood under fire. He tries to estimate, with no instruments but his ears, how close the nearest friendly troops might be. He recognizes the cadence of German voices somewhere beyond a shell burst. The language is a reminder that the front is a seam being pressed and unpressed by the movement of men and machines alike. Sometimes the front dissolves into scenes of abandonment that seem almost garden variety. A tank left with its turret turned to one side, its crew made to dismount hastily, a half-dozen jerry cans dumped by the roadside. In other places it becomes theatrical, columns of vehicles left to burn in fields, sending thick smoke to blot out the stars. The reasons are rarely simple. Vehicles might be abandoned because the units had to make a sudden move and there was no time for refueling. Vehicles might be disabled by mechanical breakdowns that could not be remedied without spare parts and fuel. They might be placed intentionally as blockades. But the through line is consistent. The war at that moment was as much about supply lines as it was about the courage of crews. The smell of burning fuses into the soldier's imagination. From beneath the dirt, he can hear the staccato of detonations, where fuel ignites and where deliberate destruction is being executed. There are stories told in the brigades about men racing alongside their own convoys, trying to toss jerry cans into trucks, attempting to siphon fuel with tin cups and improvised pumps. There are other stories about the opposite, troops who set their own stores alight because the alternative, allowing a mobile and desperate enemy to refuel and keep fighting, was worse. In the days that followed the initial German thrust, accounts speak of advanced parties that found heaps of usable fuel where retreating units had expected to be able to destroy or carry it. The discovery of intact depots jolted the tactical assessments of commanders. Suddenly, an offensive that had banked on capturing supplies to keep going found itself confronting the sobering arithmetic of loss and possession. The men in the field felt this as a moral shock. The enemy's abundance seemed obscene when measured against immediate scarcity. At the same time, Allied strength and supply was not merely a product of luck. It was the result of planning, production, and the ability to put trucks on the road and keep them moving under the most punishing conditions. The pipeline networks, both under the channel and across liberated territory, supplied a steady, if not perfectly constant flow.
Men like the drivers of the Red Ball Express, civilian dock workers who retooled their lives for war, and the engineers who laid temporary oil pipelines created a network that was both mundane and heroic. Their labor made possible a handful of small miracles at the tactical level: a tank that could reach a hill at dawn, a platoon that could be resupplied at night. We returned to the man under the earth. His hands search the pockets of a tunic and find, wrapped in waxed paper, a small sheet with scribbled numbers, coordinates, perhaps, or a telephone exchange. In spite of the cold, his fingers are clumsy, almost alien. He pulls out a chunk of dry biscuit and crams it into his mouth to dampen the taste of metal. The sound of boots approaches. He strains, pressing his ear into the frozen dirt until the grit sets off tiny static bursts in his eardrum. For a brief, delicious second, he hopes for a voice, a friendly voice calling his name. The voice does not come. A column passes, the hollow rattle of tracks, the clink of loose gear, voices speaking a language, but not speaking his name. There are moments when the mind supplies hydrogen to its own engines, imagined rescues, cinematic ruptures when a comrade dives into the earth and pulls you out. Memory interleaves with hope. He tries to conjure instructions he was given for such moments, to make noise only when safe, to signal only if lighted, to conserve air. He thinks of the small rituals soldiers cling to, a whispered prayer, a curse, the recitation of a mother's name. He imagines the sunlight, the swirl of smoke above the hedgerow, the faces of men who might lift him out. None of those imaginations are strategies. Survival at this stage will hinge on improvisation and chance. Chance arrives in the form of sound long before it arrives in light or touch. A different engine, a distant truck or armored car passes, and then, from that motion, a secondary sequence of events. The ground above him trembles as a burning vehicle's fuel ignites, sending a shock wave that lifts a slab of earth a fraction. A chandelier of grit showers his cheek. He uses the moment to force his shoulder against a plank. The wood yields, then holds. He pushes, counting, shaping his breath. Each small shift creates a space that lets in colder air, and crucially, a new smell. Not fuel this time, but the coppery tang of human sweat and the smoky peat of a man who has been working to clear debris. Outside, soldiers who had been ordered to deny supplies are now conducting a different, more urgent work, manning a sweep to recover wounded or to salvage what can be saved under a sky that is in parts red from burning depots. The decision to burn versus to save was not trivial. Commanders balanced the risk of providing resources to the enemy against the moral obligation to attempt recovery of their own.
In one case, men who had been assigned to set a depot afire continued to push back a burning tongue to reach a storage vault and drag out a wounded comrade. In another, there were reports of retreating units dropping jerry cans and hoping that weather or enemy action would prevent them from being used. From 100 yards away, a voice, not in English, but in a guttural dialect the private can barely make out, calls something that could be a name. He must rely on the slant of sound and the gut's arithmetic to decide whether to answer. If those soldiers above are enemy, his movement could be fatal. If friendly, silence could mean being left. The world thus compresses into an impossible question. Who are those boots? The man reaches for the edge again. His lungs burn. When he projects his voice, it comes as a small, thin rasp. The next minutes are a compressed montage, a shout in a language he recognizes, then a response in broken English. Figures move through smoke and snow toward a blackened turret. Hands, gloved or bare, trace the frenetic ellipse of a foxhole. Someone commands a light, a match, a steel striker, and a small flame flares and then is shielded as if it were the precious thing it is. The flame reveals faces, a hurried count, a face wearing the hard lines of someone who has seen too much. Their shadow falls across the lip of his hole. We slow here, not because the story has ended, but because the panorama takes on new layers.
What looks like a personal rescue in this moment cannot be separated from the larger decisions being made around the fire and wreckage. The men who stare red-faced into the earth are not only searching for a comrade, they are noticing the blackness of the sky where depots smolder, the shapes of tanks left in fields like bedraggled animals. A sergeant curses softly as he wipes soot from a palm and counts jerry cans with one hand while checking a wounded leg with the other. The decision tree, to burn or to save, to retreat or to hold, is being resolved in granular human increments. It is worth pausing to consider the morality embedded in that sulphurous scene. To burn one's own supplies rather than let them feed an enemy is a tactic born of calculation and desperation. It is an act that imposes a cost on one's own side to prevent a larger catastrophe. The men tasked with that work know its awful logic. Fire has agency in war. It changes plans, it clarifies choices, but it also leaves behind consequences, burned earth and the ragged remnants of what could have been used to save lives. For historians, the decisive facts of the Ardennes campaign are less about single acts of courage and more about the arithmetic of supply. The discovery at Hansfeld, the burning at Stivalo, the sudden stalling of armored thrusts, these events combined to expose an underlying truth. Modern war is decided by production and movement long before bullets meet flesh.
A soldier pinned under earth feels that truth in the literal way he feels the absence of engines. Modern armies are held up and brought down by invisible strings, factory output, tanker throughput, the daily rhythm of truck convoys. When those strings are cut or weighed down, whole formations stall. While men work to lift the private from his shallow grave, dispatches and radio reports were already beginning to shape another narrative. The German push had faltered, not because the soldiers lacked spirit, but because the machines at their back failed to sustain movement. Where a breakthrough had been expected, there were instead strung-out columns with empty tanks. Soldiers who had hoped to drive their vehicles to resupply points found themselves pushed off roads because fuel could not be spared. The German High Command was confronted with the brutal arithmetic of how many gallons were required for a spearhead to reach the Meuse, and whether those gallons could be acquired either by domestic production or by capturing enemy caches. The arithmetic often came up short. The private's rescue, when it begins, is therefore not a simple physical act, but a microcosm of the larger conflict between abundance and scarcity. Hands pry at boards. A soldier above cries out as his finger finds skin. And yet, even as isolation is broken and air floods into the small dark, there is no cinematic resolution in which the world rights itself. The men who pull him up do so with the knowledge that their own vehicles might run dry within hours, that the night will bring new orders to move or burn, that the depot's smoke will be visible from miles and will shape the decisions of commanders. The rescued man coughs soot and flurries of snow from his hair, squints against the red horizon, and sees at once the beautiful and terrible machinery that will decide whether he lives to tell the tale. At this moment of surge and relief, it is tempting to tell the rest as a tidy sequence. He goes on to safety, the army advances, history takes a clean moral turn. The truth is messier. The private's survival intersects with the larger patterns, but does not erase them. The Ardennes campaign continued to be shaped by logistics. The wartime calculus returned again and again to how many gallons could be moved, how many trucks could travel day after day, how many depots could be defended or destroyed. In the upcoming scenes, we will trace how the discovery at Hansfeld and the decision at Stivalo reverberated across command posts,
how captured tanks became icons of a stalled offensive, and how the pipelines and convoys of the Allies made possible a scale of movement the German war machine could not match. For now, the man sits wrapped in a blanket that trembles in the cold wind. A medic warms his hands and checks for frostbite. Around them, the ground still smolders in places where denial fires had been set.
Above, the night sky does a slow bibliography. Stars, smoke, the arc of searchlights. The private feels the weight of the world, both lifted and still pressing. He is alive, but the terms of survival remain contingent on engines, pipelines, and men who keep driving. If this kind of sourced, long-form history is the kind of story you want to explore in full, the mechanics of supply, the intimate human stakes, and the surprising moments where individual survival intersects with industrial power, subscribe for more deeply sourced narratives. The evidence that follows is drawn from battlefield reports, logistical records, and personal testimonies collected after the war. Where names or figures are uncertain, they are noted for verification in our sourcing. When the private finally stands, helped by a pair of rough hands, he looks at the horizon and sees the consequences of choices made far from his foxhole. A cluster of tanks sits stranded in a hollow like a stranded shoal. Soldiers move around them like scavengers and mechanics, measuring the cost of mobility in cans and hoses. The campfire conversations are equal parts awe and bitter arithmetic. That day's mileage, the cost of a tank's engine, the number of gallons required to keep an armored column moving out of a pocket. And somewhere beyond the hedge, the smoke from burning depots writes a ledger in the sky. He pulls his boot on, bites into cold biscuit, and for a moment imagines the future as a clean path. Then a nearby officer, with frost in his beard and stubble of exhaustion, unfolds a map and points to a cluster of red marks indicating supply depots and blocked roads. The officer's finger slides to one word and then another: Hansfeld, Stavello. The names anchor the night like beacons and gravestones at once. The private hears them, feels the syllables as if they were physical objects falling in his palm. It is not yet the end. The rescue has created space for a reflection that will need evidence, numbers, and the testimony of drivers, engineers, and commanders to be fully understood. The rest of the story, how the discovery at Hansfeld changed strategic plans, how the burning at Stavello denied fuel and forced improvisation, how American industrial capacity gave a margin of resilience that the Germans lacked, must be traced through records and the voices of the men who moved the supplies. We will follow those threads next, moving from the close and claustrophobic to the broad and infrastructural, and in doing so, we will see how the fortunes of a single soldier were shaped by forces measured in gallons and miles rather than merely by valor. The men who dragged him from the earth did not have the leisure to celebrate. Even as breath came back in hot, strangled gulps and his eyes blinked against soot and snow, orders were being barked and radios checked. A sergeant, his face burned raw by the light of denial fires, slapped a bandage into place and pointed without looking. "Keep moving. Recon sweep. Watch the hedgerows." The private could feel the urgency like a hand at his shoulder. Rescue had been only one of dozens of small tasks being carried out that night, each one an answer to the same question: what do we do with fuel when the enemy might take it? The discovery at Hansfeld did not happen in a vacuum. Word traveled the same way the fuel did, not by mystery, but by movement. A patrol finds an intact compound, someone radios battalion, battalion notifies brigade, and somewhere in headquarters, a map gets a new annotation. Those annotations rearranged plans. In field reports, the piles of jerry cans and drums were described in blunt terms, enough to keep columns moving for days, perhaps weeks. For men who had been rationing miles like they were rationing cigarettes, the sight was at once a concrete boon and a psychological blow. Here, sitting under canvas or behind hedgerows, they could finally see on the ground the inequality that intelligence had only hinted at, an inequality not of will, but of gallons. Commanders on both sides recalculated. German staff officers who hoped to find their salvation in seized stockpiles watched in frustration as maps that once promised springboards began to look like traps. In the small hours, reports from the front line were not full of grand pronouncements, but of logistical minutiae, counts of drums, the condition of pumps, the extent of smoke from deliberate burning. Those details are the nuts and bolts of strategy. When they shift, strategies change. Hansfeld's significance lay in what it revealed about the shape of Allied logistics. It was not merely a single store of fuel. It was evidence of a system capable of accumulating and protecting reserves. The Allies did not rely on a single depot, but on webs of supply, refineries inland and across the channel, pipelines that pushed product toward the front, and, most visibly to the men who lived and died by the mile, lines of trucks. Together, these elements created redundancy. If one node failed, another could be pressed into service. If weather or enemy action interrupted a road, pipelines or secondary depots could compensate. For men like the private just pulled from the dirt, this redundancy meant that, despite the chaos of battle, an engine could still be fed in the morning. For the German columns pressing westward, the absence of such redundancy was a mortal liability. It is important to be precise about the kind of shortage that mattered. Tanks do not merely consume fuel, they consume it in a rhythm of movement, of advance and maneuver. A single armored push could require tens of thousands of gallons over a matter of days.
Once a formation committed itself to thrusting along the roads of the Ardennes, it had to count on a steady drip, daily consignments of fuel and spare parts that would arrive at staging points like beats in a heart. When that drip faltered, the formation's tempo slowed, then sputtered. And tempo, how fast you can move, how long you can keep pressure on an opponent, was the currency of the German plan. The burning of depots at places like Stavelot was therefore not merely theatrical, it was a calculated denial intended to make the calculus unfavorable for the passing army. The images of black smoke curling into cold skies are emblematic. They are both a tactical decision and an ethical burden. Commanders had to choose between local survivability, saving goods that might help their own men, and strategic preventions, destroying goods so that an enemy could not use them to extend an offensive. From the individual soldier's vantage point, these decisions were visible in the fields around him. A tractor left lip up amid frozen ditch water, a mound of drums seared black at the edges, a line of tanks with hoods open like mechanical corpses. Those scenes were the context for a recurring moral improvisation that men performed in real time. A squad might find itself ordered to guard a burning field until embers cooled. Another squad might be told to abandon kit because the pace of retreat demanded lightness. These micro-choices aggregated into macro outcomes. The German army's gamble, advance quickly and seize supplies, depended on a balance that Hansfeld and similar finds upset. There are field reports that record commanders swearing into maps, redoing routes, and stripping fuel allocations down to the last gallon. The arithmetic was unsentimental. Engines had to be kept alive to be useful. On the Allied side, the machinery that kept engines alive was astonishingly prosaic. The Red Ball Express, for example, functioned less like a single glorious actor and more like a networked choreography of thousands of choices, a truck assigned to a route, a driver ordered to start at 2 in the morning despite frost, a maintenance crew patching a leaky gasket with a length of pipe and sheer persistence.
The drivers were not romantic heroes, but laborers in uniform who kept calendars full of miles. In the end, the system's strength lay in scale and repetition. A convoy could be harassed, flooded roads could slow progress, storms could dump snow on routes, but the routine of trucks moving back and forth day after day created a flow of fuel that the Germans simply did not have. The pipelines are less visible, but perhaps more decisive. Stretching underwater and through liberated territory, they functioned as steady veins, delivering volumes to where they were needed without the fragility of a road convoy.
Laying and protecting such infrastructure was technical, dangerous work. Engineers wrestled with pumps and fittings in mud and cold, often under threat from air attack or long-range artillery. Their work rarely makes for romantic copy, but it matters more in the ledger of victory. The ability to keep a theater supplied is a mechanical fact as much as a strategic one. Back at the level of the private, those mechanical facts were visible in fragments. A pump left intact behind a shattered wall, a hose coiled like a sleeping snake, the smell of oil. As he sat among men counting jerry cans and swapping tobacco for stories of roads traveled, those mechanical truths became moral metaphors. If the war could be measured in cannon and courage, it could also be measured in daily throughput and the humanity that kept engines fed. In the days that followed Hansfeld, field units reported a curious phenomenon. The German formations began to look less like a single coordinated surge and more like an assemblage of patched-together thrusts, sometimes moving in fits towards secondary objectives, sometimes halted until the chance of supply presented itself. Convoys that were supposed to be resupply columns turned into scavenging parties. Tanks, once the decisive instrument of mobility, often became immobile artillery emplantments when their fuel reserves ran low. In the terms of operational art, mobility without sustainment is brittle. The Ardennes campaign exposed that brittleness. There were human consequences that statistics do not fully capture. For crews who watched their tanks' fuel gauges dip into the red, the moral of the moment was not a lesson in logistics, but a felt sense of abandonment. When a commander ordered engines abandoned to expedite movement, crews felt the shame of leaving a machine that had been the object of their care. Field notes and personal accounts record men returning to burned wreckage to retrieve personal items, or lingering to whisper a farewell to a turret in which they had felt safe. These small acts are the human punctuation marks in a story otherwise inscribed in drums and pipelines. Those human acts also fed into a larger morale dynamic. When soldiers on the receiving end of an offensive saw enemy columns stalled by their own empty gauges, a psychological effect took hold. Victory was reinterpreted as material arithmetic, not the fickle grace of combat. Conversely, when German soldiers found intact caches like Hansfeld, their immediate reaction was not only logistical calculation, but a kind of existential disorientation. How could the enemy be so well supplied? That disorientation had operational consequences, because an army that believes it is outgunned or out-resourced can lose the initiative even when tactical opportunities remain. At the operational center, the German High Command faced a truth that required a shift of ambition. The original plan required fluids. Roads must be opened, bridges must be held, pumps must feed columns. Each lost drum added to the logistical deficit. Contrary to the narrative of decisive armored thrusts being purely a function of boldness, the Ardennes operation turned on a ledger. The Berlin factories produced fewer barrels, the refineries were scarred from strategic bombing, and the transportation network had been degraded. American industrial output, supported by an economy converted to war production and a manpower system that rapidly shifted workers from peacetime industry to wartime needs, created a hydraulic advantage that was difficult to counter. None of this discounts the combat skill or bravery of German troops. It merely reframes the terms of decision.
A brave man in a tank without fuel cannot exploit his bravery. A talented commander without sustainment channels cannot turn a tactical soundness into a strategic success. In that sense, the private's near burial was emblematic. The earth had pressed him down physically, but the larger forces pressing on both sides were mechanical, conveyor belts of oil and metal that shaped the possibilities of life and death. As the private regained his bearings, medics pressed him to report details. He could tell them little in the way they needed. He had not learned the model numbers of tanks or the exact layout of depots. He could report only sensations, smell, sound, the weight of earth, the taste of grit. Those sensations were useful in their own way. Engineers used sensory reports to estimate whether a depot had been simply burned out or deliberately salvaged. A column of black smoke suggested thorough destruction. Scattered drums suggested hurried abandonment. Each detail informed salvage and denial operations. The salvage crews were themselves a peculiar hybrid of clerks and scavengers. They moved through fields like accountants, noting serial numbers when present, cataloging pumps, estimating remaining usable oil, and sending those estimates back up the chain. Their reports converted physical observation into operational planning. It was not just having resources, it was the institutional capacity to translate observation into movement. There were moments when the private, still shivering and wrapped in blankets, felt the strange irony of being a small node within that institutional capacity. A quartermaster asked him a dozen questions, where he had been, what he had heard, then nodded and walked away to rebottle that information into a line on a manifest. His rescue was a human event, but the decision to expend fuel to move a rescue party, to allocate a truck to him versus to a supply run, was a logistic decision in miniature. Those decisions, multiplied across the front, are how wars are made.
It helps to trace briefly and concretely some of the channels that turned production into movement. Refineries near the channel and inland processed crude into usable fuel and then fed pipelines and tankers. The pipelines pushed product toward points of consumption without the vulnerability of a road convoy. Where roads were necessary, truck columns provided the final leg. Each node required labor, operators for pumps, drivers for trucks, mechanics for vehicles, guards for depots. The labor was often civilian, dock workers, oilmen repurposed as military labor, local contractors working under a military plan. Their contribution is the quiet part of the story. An army cannot live without the hands that keep its blood moving. For the German army, by contrast, the same chain had been severed at multiple points. Allied strategic bombing had disrupted refineries. Shortages of synthetic fuel technology and raw materials had limited replacement capacity. Transportation networks were fragmented by retreat and by interdiction. Where the German force tried to substitute tactical gains for industrial deficit, hoping that seized depots would make up for lost production, it learned the cost of such thinking when the numbers on the map did not add up. Back on the ground, this arithmetic translated into episodes of improvisation and improvisation's inevitable failure. Some German units attempted to jury-rig tanks with makeshift tanks, or to siphon fuel with cut hoses and tin cups. Sometimes they managed to keep a few vehicles going. Often they did not. The result was a front line whose shape was sometimes determined by mechanical failures as much as by bullets. Commanders were forced to withhold offensive options because the fuel would not permit the exploitation of local success. The private story from rescue through convalescence was not linear. It was punctuated by the small bureaucratic acts that make militaries function. He had to be entered into a ledger,
given a temporary assignment while his unit reorganized, and fit into a distribution of labor that prioritized the movement of supplies and the maintenance of mobility. He found himself, within a week, assigned to a small maintenance group tasked with tending to sidelined vehicles, a role that, in a larger sense, made him closer to the true engine of war than frontline honor ever could. Caring for the immobilized machines, he learned to recognize the smell of a broken carburetor versus the tang of contaminated diesel. He learned to strip snow out of vents and patch canvas that kept pumps from freezing. The work was pragmatic and unglamorous, but it placed him at the heart of the logistical problem that had almost killed him. The human scale of this labor should not be underestimated. A single functioning pump could mean the difference between a tank being able to reach a hill at dawn or sitting cold while the enemy dug in.
Men who could coax life back into a seized engine were as valuable, in context, as men who could fire a gun. The private's transformation from buried survivor to hands-on mechanic is a small narrative turn that mirrors the larger truth of the campaign. Survival often depended on the ability to sustain movement. As the Ardennes winter wore on, the broader picture clarified in the minds of commanders and historians. The German offensive had achieved some tactical successes. Pockets had been formed, towns had changed hands, and the suddenness of the attack had caught many units unprepared. Yet, when historians look back, they emphasize the logistic ceiling that the offensive hit. American industrial output, coupled with the ability to prioritize and reroute supply lines, created a margin that the Germans could not match. At the operational level, battles are won by breaking the enemy's ability to move and resupply. In the Ardennes, the Germans had discovered that their capacity to move was limited by factors beyond immediate battlefield control. That discovery shows up in small but telling decisions. Orders begin to reference the need to conserve fuel, to prioritize armored formations over lighter units, to choose which routes receive the scarce gallons available. Those are not dramatic in a cinematic sense, but they are decisive. The image of a commander holding a cupped map and making choices about whether to fuel a battalion or to reserve fuel for engine repair is as consequential as any bayonet charge. For the private, the campaign left a lasting impression of scale and contingency. He remembered nights when the sky was orange with denial fires, and mornings when the smoke had been blown into indistinct wisps, leaving behind the charred skeletons of drums and the bland residue of soot. He remembered mechanics bending over barrels with improvised tools and drivers ready to drive until a pump failed. And he remembered the odd moral arithmetic of burning to deny, how men would light fuel to keep the enemy from having it, accepting the flavor of loss as strategic necessity. When the offensive finally frayed and pushed back into less dramatic, more attritional operations, the private found himself reflecting on the small certainties that had sustained him. The bandage that stopped the bleeding, a comrade's hand that had found his wrist in the dark, the rough engineering knowledge that let him work a frozen pump. His escape from the earth was not miraculous in any mystical sense. It was the product of chance, a shock wave that loosened a plank, a passing squad that heard a rasp, hands that pulled him up, and it was enabled by institutions that kept some engines alive. The story's improbable moment sits at the intersection of contingency and system, a human act shaped by the tides of supply. We must close by returning to the larger lesson the Ardennes teaches. The private's rescue is a remarkable human story, and one worth telling in its own right.
But his survival also illuminates a broader historical truth. In modern industrialized war, the decisive edges are often logistical. Factories, pipelines, and truck drivers make possible the movement upon which tactical brilliance depends. The Ardennes offensive shows that the absence of sustainment can limit even the boldest plans.
That does not make the war a mere arithmetic problem. Combat remains messy and human. Men die through error and bravery both. But the campaign tells us how the arithmetic organizes the mess. A front that lacks the throughput to keep engines moving cannot sustain an offensive. A high-spirited thrust cannot be converted into strategic success if there is no way to move fuel forward. In the end, the private who almost suffocated beneath the earth survived because men and systems were still working to move and protect the supplies on which life at the front depended. His escape is a human drama. The reason he had the chance to live is the product of industrial scale and the men who ran it. If this kind of long-form, sourced history speaks to you, stories that marry human moments to systemic forces, there is more to explore. The sources behind this narrative include battlefield reports, logistical records, and collections of personal testimony. Where names or figures in contemporary records are unclear, those items are noted for verification in production materials. You can find a detailed sourcing list and recommended readings in the video description, including archival references and works that analyze the logistics of the Ardennes campaign. He was buried alive during the war. He crawled out, coughing and cold, and went on, like many others, not as a mythic hero, but as a man who had been held down by earth and by an exhausted machine. How he escaped is a human story. Why he had the chance to escape is a story of engines, pipelines, and men who kept driving. If you found this account compelling, like the video, subscribe for more deeply sourced narratives, and check the description for the reading list and our next deep dive into the Red Ball Express and the pipelines that kept the armies moving.